And we're back like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your night before Valentine's Day, everyone's favorite Hallmark holiday, here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Now, significant meaning for me. Not really in a very good way, but in a life altering way. It's one of those life events. Imagine that some of you can identify with this. There are numerous occurrences in my life, scenarios, situations, long gestating, that appeared to be disastrous at the time, going through a certain trial was awful, steeped in failure, in misery, in disappointment. But eventually, I reached a point. It was actually a net positive. What appeared to be bad at the time was actually, I hate to say it this way, it was a step in the right direction. It was the road to personal growth. Unfortunately, sometimes people come by good things the hard way. You know who said that? Yelburton Abraham Tittle Jr., Y.A. Tittle, former New York Giants quarterback, next to Dan Marino, the greatest quarterback who never won a Super Bowl. There's a story with Y.A. Tittle, but that'll be for another day. So, in a recent episode, I discussed my screenwriting career and the fact that I kind of worked on the outskirts of Hollywood and the movie business for many years, getting projects optioned, being hired for projects. So, give you a little window into the thinking of somebody. I wasn't just, not that there's anything wrong with just being a movie geek, a film geek, a kind of a seam head, but that I was actually involved in the creative arm of the business. So I had what used to be called, and maybe it's still called that, social anxiety disorder. I would get very flustered very quickly. It's part of the being on the autism spectrum aspect of my personality, the neurodivergency. You know, I was never diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. I don't think that the idea is that suddenly people are more likely to be autistic than they were 50 years ago. I simply think it's a matter of diagnosing correctly. My father was born in 1942. He very clearly would be on the autism spectrum. And he told me that there were a lot of people that he grew up with who were much more impaired than he was. He wasn't really impaired. He was just incredibly shy and awkward and probably looked at the ground a lot when he was a little boy. But that's neither here nor there. The idea is that the neurons, things didn't fire correctly for me as a much younger person. As far back as when I was 6, I had difficulty looking people in the eye when we spoke. Now, in my case, it didn't mean that I wasn't able to pay attention to them, but it was very difficult for me to directly engage people. And I don't know why, other than that I was afraid. I was scared. Didn't make any sense, but that's how it was. Now, this didn't happen all the time. It was more likely if it was a circumstance where I was already a little shaky or a little nervous. Because if I'm sitting there and the teacher, let's say first grade teacher, asks a question, my hand shot up. I wasn't like, oh, I can't answer this question. But the social anxiety disorder that I had, that I dealt with and eventually overcame, I like to think in part because of the unbelievable, disastrous story that I'm about to tell you. Within normal parameters, nobody dies. Spoiler alert, nobody dies. It's not a movie. There's no good guys and bad guys. There's neither good guy, bad guy, nothing. It's just life. It's just life as it was for people such as myself who looked upon the idea of, heaven forbid, asking a young lady for her phone number, is like asking for the nuclear launch codes. That earth-shattering of a thing, that big a deal. And I remember in the first American Pie movie, a little bit of wisdom in an unlikely way, and from an unlikely source, terrific actress Natasha Lyonne. She's the only character in the movie. She talks about sex a lot, and everybody kind of comes to her, no pun intended, for advice. But she doesn't actually have sex in the movie. And I always thought that was funny that they did it that way. It had to be intentional, right? But there are various characters that go to her and they're saying, well, I want to do this, and maybe it's not the right time, and I want this to be forever, and this, and everybody has a story. And what she says, it's not rocket science. It's not the be-all, end-all. It's just sex. Just a little harmless sex. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it's just a little harmless getting to know somebody. But in my addled adolescent brain, it appeared to be life and death. It appeared to be everything riding on whether or not somebody is going to say yes. Remember Ghostbusters? When someone asks you if you're a god, you say yes. It was not nearly as big a deal as I made it out to be. Now, it's a big deal if you really like somebody, you ask them out. It's a big deal if they say yes. It's a big deal if they say no. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big a deal. People get rejected all the time. You pick yourself up, you move on. But I didn't see it that way. And the problem with having the kind of narrow vision that I did is, and this is something that you can Google, people who are neurodivergent, people who are on the autism spectrum, people with social anxiety disorder, they center and focus an enormous amount of their own psychological energy on like one thing. This is why I always tell people, there are certain things I will never make a mistake with. I'll never fuck certain things up. I'm very unlikely to ever forget my keys because I'm so paranoid about what? About forgetting my keys. There are certain areas, and my dad, may he rest in peace, he was very similar in this regard. He would say, there are some things that Jeremy's never going to get wrong. He's just not. Because he's so obsessed with 2 or 3 different things, he's not going to mess those up. It's the other 300 things, well, that might be a bit of a problem. Tunnel vision, right? So in brief, I had very little in the way of a social life all through primary school. I wasn't necessarily an outsider. That would be a stretch. But I didn't quite fit in with any particular group. I was too nerdy to fit in with the kind of jocks, if that's really I don't even know if they use that word anymore, but I was too nerdy to fit in with that crowd. And I wasn't quite bookwormish enough to fit in with the smart kids, although I kind of straddled both worlds. I never really fit in entirely with either, although most of my close friends were very intelligent. I mean, what are you going to do, right? But I did not have a social life, and I did not believe that I would have a social life. The other problem with this process is that you can only see in terms of absolutes. There were gray areas that I did not detect, that I would detect in later years. And I would understand there was something in my wiring that was making me act and not act the way that I was. It was not a failing of me as a human being, which is what I mistakenly thought. But we'll get to that. So I did not date, quote unquote. I did not have any scenario where I was out alone with a young lady, let's say when I was 12, 13, 6th grade, 7th grade. But my perception was that girls just weren't into me. Now, the thing is, they probably weren't, because I was miserable. I always had a bad attitude, and I didn't really make eye contact. So starting from that point, if you were to reboot the Matrix and give 13-year-old me a better demeanor, a better ability to interact with people, actually engaging with them as we're speaking, not be such an asshole, I guarantee you that kid would have had a better social life. But I didn't see it that way. I saw it as failing of me. I'm gross. I'm disgusting, whatever. So that continued well into my teens. And I was a kid who played a lot of sports. But then I kind of stopped playing. I stopped doing much of anything. And I went from A student, everybody's bragging about me. My grandparents are so proud. They were the kind of grandparents that would hang my A pluses, on their refrigerator. But I started to slip because you go through adolescence and you start getting ideas, you start seeing things. Heaven forbid, you know someone who is a friend of yours who's hooking up with a hot girl. We could joke about it now on TikTok in 2025. But in 1990, there was no social media, but it was still difficult to process. Why aren't I good enough for that? This is how I thought. Now, looking back on it, it wasn't a question of good enough. Why don't you change your behavior? But all of this went right over my head. So I did not perceive myself to have a chance. I may have been right, but only because of how I behaved. Because action and behavior do matter, and I was thinking that it didn't. I was thinking that this was all preordained. We're all in the matrix. I didn't say this, but that I can't affect any change. I am simply screwed. And another thing that I did, which was not very wise as far as making friends, and maybe even making friends with a female classmate, is I was very boisterous and forthcoming with what I just said. It'll never happen for me. I suck. I can't do anything. I can't do anything. Just negative, negative, negative. Finally, I got to my senior year in high school, and I was significantly overweight relative to my, if you want to say bone structure. But for somebody I have kind of thin wrists, my best weight, if you assume somebody who doesn't work out, it would have been somewhere 160 to 170. I was like 215 at the beginning of my senior year in high school, and I grew another 1.5 inches to 2 inches. I was one of those kids, because we all remember this. There are guys that just sprouted, and by the time they're 13, they're 6 feet tall, and they didn't grow anymore. There was a stretch in 7th grade where I was suddenly short, but I just kept growing 1 to 2 inches a year. And at the beginning of my senior year in high school, I was still under 6 feet, and I ended up about 6'1.5", 6'1 3/4". So I was out of shape. I was miserable. I was a mess. And I guess I kind of had, if you'll pardon the expression, I had a bit of a come to Jesus moment. And this is really goofy, and I apologize in advance for how goofy this is. I had a dream. I had a dream, yeah. I had a dream. It was not a sexual dream. It was a PG-rated dream. With some other classmates of mine and myself were in this dream. And when I woke up, I suddenly had an unfathomable crush on one of the girls that was in the dream and was one of my classmates. So that began a very long, quite torturous process of trying to, heaven forbid, say hello. Not say hello to my little friend. Say hello. You're interested in this young lady. You know who she is. She knows who. Just say hi. Hey, what did you think of that test? Doesn't matter. What I understand now and didn't understand then is I was 17 going on 18. But maturity-wise and in terms of capacity to interact in what we would call a normal fashion, I was remedial. I was at nursery school level because I had not successfully done it. It doesn't mean that I never had female friends, but it's not the same thing as realizing that you would like to get to know somebody in a more than just doing homework and stuff like that. Although you could also do homework, but I didn't have the capacity. I needed practice. I needed reps. It's the same concept with therapy. There are certain things which now seem flagrantly obvious, which now seem easy. Old hat. I needed to have already taken baby steps, and I hadn't taken any. And the old phrase, from the fire pan into the fire. I just tried to throw myself into it without taking the time to think it through. And all the while, I was blaming myself. These are all very easy to discern from therapists. And this is why I'm a big believer in therapy. I don't think that this is gobbledygook. I don't think that social anxiety disorder is make-believe, that it isn't real. Oh, it's very real. It's very real. I lived it, and I know people who still suffer panic attacks. I haven't had a panic attack since I was 18. So, have a crush. Try to interact in a normal fashion. This is sometime in like October of 1991, to give you an idea how long ago this was. This is 33 and a half years almost. I'm having exceeding amounts of trouble even talking to this young lady I was interested in. And the days and weeks and months are starting to pass. Now, we shared one class, but it's not really important whether you shared a class. If two people or if one person was interested, it's not that difficult, even back then in the Stone Ages, to find out. Is it okay if I talk to her? Yeah. I did get a green light. Now, green light, that doesn't mean green light like all the way, but it means, bro, what do you think she's going to do? Snap at you? Call you a loser? It's okay. You can go talk to her. So these are things now, again, 100%. But 17 and then 18-year-old me was pretty much a basket case of nerves. I was so scared. And here's the easiest way to explain social anxiety disorder as I experienced it, and as probably some of you as well. It's not that you can't do something. It's that your physiology is limiting you. It is tricking you into thinking the situation is more dire than it actually is. So, for example, pretend that any situation where you're going to have a nervous reaction, you know, the movie Inside Out kind of gets into this a little, that any situation, taking a test that you didn't study for, that might be an 8 out of 10 if it's an important test. For someone such as myself now, me asking someone out on a date or asking somebody for their phone number, that's still going to trigger a nervous reaction. But it's going to trigger a nervous reaction of somewhere between 3 and 4, maybe not even. 18-year-old me, just the idea of talking person to person and saying something as benign as, can I have your phone number? That was like a 9.5 out of 10. That was reacting as if you're in combat, pinned down by enemy fire, and your life might end. It seems like an exaggeration, but it is not an exaggeration. That is exactly what it felt like. And the reason why I was not talking to this person is because whenever I attempted to, my physiology would shut me down. Well, what does that mean? What it means is my hands would start to shake, my knees would start to go weak, where if I did not sit down immediately, I would fall down. This all happened. So, knowing that, I continued to push forward. Once again, I needed to think this through, because I understood intellectually I had nothing to be afraid of. The worst case scenario, the word no, I'm not interested, it's not that big a deal. But it felt like the end of the world was nigh, that I had to get everything exactly right. And I couldn't get anything right because I wasn't prepared, because I was so far behind everyone else in my social conditioning. I was slow to develop. This is why when I tell people now I'm a late bloomer, they kind of laugh. And I mean, it's okay to laugh, but it's not an exaggeration. 18-year-old me was not an adult. There are 18-year-olds that are. I wasn't even close. I was remedial. I was 9 or 10 years old, maturity-wise. So even with this fear and this inability to interact properly, I still wanted to do something. I wanted to put myself into a situation, a sink or swim situation. Just go for it. And the idea of just go for it is a good idea, because the truth is there are moments in life that we will not get again, moments that will pass us by if we don't move on them. That is all true. And I would always encourage people to take the chance. Ask for the phone number. Ask, can I see you outside of class? Would you like to get coffee? Always. The problem was my heart was in the right place. I had the right idea, but physiologically, I was not, it wasn't the right time. I wasn't ready. But I had a plan, and I bought a box of chocolates. As January of 1992 moved into February, I bought a box of chocolates, and I wrote, it wasn't really a love letter. To call it a love letter would be kind of an insult to real love letters. It just was basically an I like you letter, would be more accurate. And I went through multiple drafts. I was just saying too much. It's funny, I was learning how to be a writer in this particular time frame. Because without somebody telling me, enter late, get out early, say as little as possible, as few words as possible, say as much as you can. So rather than write a fucking novel, I'm going to write 6 handwritten pages of how I like you. I mean, come on. That might work if you're 8 or 9 years old. Bro, you're 18. You can get drafted. Well, not anymore. You could enlist in the military and get your head shot off. Some states you can drink. You can drive a tractor. I didn't see any of that. Just didn't land. So I edited, and I ended up with about 3 lines. And I got to tell you, it was perfect. It was exactly, I said just enough. It was not offensive. It was not inappropriate. I find you very interesting, and I'd like to get to know you better. That's it. I didn't need 6 pages of woe is me. I have no faith in myself. I suck. I can't do it. Yeah, that's a great seduction technique. Boy, I suck. Want to go out? But it was a step, a tiny little step in the right direction. My radar sense went off. Bro, this can't work. 6 pages of you talking about how you suck? Come on, man. Do something else. So I did something else. Now, as luck would have it, this is one of those things where it felt like it was just fate. It was fate for this to happen the way that it happened. The object of my affection was on a girls' basketball team. And they had a game, incredibly, at Massapequa High School the night before Valentine's Day. I mean, it was like the script was written, no pun intended. The script was written. It was a perfect setup. But deep down, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to pull it off because I didn't have the wherewithal. I didn't have the physiological capability. My body was going to fail. I knew this, but I went ahead anyway. So I had a couple of friends, 3 friends in particular, who came along with me. And when I tell you, the level of fear that I felt sitting in the bleachers watching this basketball game, yeah, the master plan was at the end of the game, I was going to walk across the court the night before Valentine's Day and hand her a box of chocolates and the I like you letter. That is really cool. I mean, we've seen that sort of thing in a movie. I was hoping that it would happen, but I knew that I couldn't do that. Me of today, yes, no problem. It would have been a joke, and it might have gotten a laugh, but I wasn't trying to do this for laughs. I was serious. Game came to an end, and as the second half, I remember this, as the second half went forth, and I'm sitting there in the bleachers, I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to stand. My legs felt like they had gone dead or they were going dead. And it wasn't from, I'd been sitting for so long. No, I had continued to get up and stretch my legs. But the last time I stretched my legs with about 5 minutes left in the game, I almost fell. So when I sat back down, and now there's like 30 seconds left in the game, my hands are starting to shake. My knees they're not working properly. So buzzer sounds, and I go to push myself up, and I am gripped by a full-blown panic attack where everything seemed to stop working at the same time. It's like my entire system shut down at this exact moment. Everything stopped working. I began hyperventilating. I wasn't even aware that I was breathing. That is how fucked up this was. I did not even notice that I was breathing. It just felt like I wasn't breathing, and suddenly I was hyperventilating. And I was grabbing for the bleachers. I don't know what I was going to do, grabbing for the bleachers. But basically, I was sitting there on the bleachers choking to death for a couple of seconds. And in those desperate seconds, well, in my head, I let loose a whole bunch of expletives directed at myself, but I thought this was it. I made it to 18. This is where I go. I'm going to make it out of that auditorium. I mean, it's so absurd to think that I thought I was going to die, but I couldn't breathe. I was choking, and what if my lungs don't open back up? Well, then I am going to die, aren't I? One of my friends ended up giving the young lady the I like you letter and the box of chocolates. That is as nice of a thing that anybody had done for me up to that point. Because there are a lot of young people, whether it's 2025, whether it's the 90s, whether it's the 50s, that would never do something like that, that would see somebody struggling and just choking and gasping and failing as I did and say, you know what, fuck them. I was lucky. I had good friends. So, box of chocolates, love letter. But I needed help getting out of the auditorium. By the time I stood up, after I knew that this guy was giving her the gear, the air started to return to my lungs, and I began to get a little bit of feeling back in my legs, but it was very difficult for me to get out of the auditorium. It was bad. So long story very short, because I don't want to keep you here any longer than we have to. The letter and box of chocolates, it's not that it didn't have the desired effect. It didn't make a difference. It didn't make a difference because I was still going to have to do something that at that particular time I was incapable of doing. I was still going to have to interact. And I don't know what I imagined as far as, because when you talk about wanting to go out with somebody, that means you're with them. You are engaging with them. It seemed beyond my grasp. And it's insane that this is what happened, but this is what happened. So despite the fact that I was told, bro, it's okay. She says she wants you to talk to her. Doesn't mean that it was going to be more than talking. But you have to start somewhere with anything in life. Every great journey begins with a first step. I tried to jump to step 6. I should have started at step 1. I needed practice. I needed to do some preparatory work before dashing headlong. And it's another metaphor for life. You got to put the work in beforehand. You can't skip steps. I skipped a lot of steps here. I was in therapy, but the therapy I don't think was directed correctly for what I needed at that particular point in my life. And also, I stupidly didn't share any of this with my psychotherapist. That would have been something we should have talked about. As bad as that was, though, and I was really hurting, not going to pretend that I wasn't. When that situation did not go anywhere because I simply could not interact in a normal fashion. I just couldn't. I thought that it was always going to be this way. I despaired. I was despondent, always sad, woe is me, again, the same kind of nonsense. But at a certain point, I hadn't gotten as much out of my life as I should have through my middle teens. Yeah, it sucks being 15, 16, 17, 18 in a lot of cases, but I was still not getting nearly enough. it was as if I was just going through the motions. And this experience, which it's not that even that it turned bad, it was always going to be bad. There was no way for me to win. I didn't fail. I had something wrong with me, clearly. But it was something that could be made better with practice. Now, I'm living proof you don't necessarily need anti-anxiety drugs. A lot of practice. You need to fail and fail and fail. You never become immune to failure, but you begin to understand it's just part of life. But this experience, February 13th, 1992, and then Valentine's Day, and then the rest of the school year of continuing to kind of flounder. I had not been that engaged by life. I was getting ready to go to college, and I was just going through the motions. This entire experience, as horrendous as it was to actually live through, one day after another of getting my hopes up, I'm going to be able to talk to her, come crashing to earth, over and over and over and over. Months of the same day repeating itself. At least I was feeling something. Pain, yeah. Misery. Some level of suffering. It's not real suffering, but when you're a kid, you don't know any better. You don't know any different. You're hurting, and that's all that matters. But me at 15, me at 16, me at 17, the first part of being 18, I was apathetic about life. I wasn't. We'll talk about disgracing your family, but I wasn't even sure. I was just, nothing seemed to matter. Nothing makes any difference. This is all bullshit. You know, classic Gen X. But then the kinds of other guys that said this is all bullshit ended up being CEOs. So just saying that doesn't mean anything. But I was apathetic. Now, I'm telling you, the pain, the psychological trauma somehow galvanized me. Because as bad as it was, I felt alive. I was an exposed nerve, crying and whining and moaning and all of that. But I was alive. And in a crazy way, I was invigorated. Life was worth living. It's worth trying. Yes, you failed. But maybe you won't always fail. Yes, I will. That was my attitude. I needed a lot more practice than almost anyone. But eventually, it took years. It took more than a decade, for crying out loud. That's fucking nuts. But it was worth it. And when I look back on that ridiculous meltdown, it wasn't really a meltdown. It was the only logical outcome. But when I look back on that, it helped me to grow and change. It gave me focus, purpose, a reason for being, a reason to go forward. I ended up going to college. I ended up graduating from New York University. I have gotten to have a life. That goofy kid that I was didn't think he was going to have the life that he ended up having, has ended up enjoying. It's all part of the tapestry, the good, the bad, and the ugly of a life, anyone's. I am just grateful that this situation, which sucked, I look back on it. It's not that it's a good memory, but it's critical. It's an essential component of my life. I failed there so that I would eventually succeed elsewhere. That wouldn't work, but you have to keep trying. Or as Rocky Balboa says, don't stop nothing. All the times that I got down on myself, well, I can't do it. No, I couldn't do it at that particular time. I wasn't ready. But there will come a day when you will be. Stay the course. Keep moving forward, right? Another Rocky reference. No matter how hard you get hit, keep moving forward. I wasn't exactly man about town throughout my 20s, but at a certain point in time, I've had a greater level of appreciation for the highs that I've gotten to experience. I just happened to bottom out before most other people because I knew a lot of guys, and some of you can identify with Susan. But that's what I've been thinking about on this February 13th, 33 school specials. Speaking of school. But if you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. New episode, probably about movies, real soon. Until then, peace out and happy